Welcome everybody. We're gonna go ahead and get started here in just a minute. I'm just waiting for some more people to filter on in. But yeah, about a minute, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for being here. About 30 more seconds, and then I'll go ahead and kick this off. I'll kind of get ready here. Okay. So let's go ahead and switch this over. Okay, I think it's been long enough. We'll go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Michael. I'll be your host for today for this webinar. If you're unfamiliar with me, I'm a cloud solutions architect from Massdriver. Massdriver is a visual internal developer platform that enables engineers and developers to deploy production-ready cloud infrastructure and applications in a matter of minutes. During the webinar, please don't hesitate to ask any questions, anything like that. Some of my coworkers and myself, we're going to be watching the chat, answering your questions or talking about any topics that you might want to dive into. So today, we're going to be talking about how to add API artifacts or API endpoints to your applications in Massdriver. Specifically, we're going to be covering some basics, like what an artifact is and how the API artifact definition looks. We'll then add an API artifact to my demo backend application, and then we'll finish deploying and testing the artifact by connecting it to my demo front-end application. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So what are artifacts? Before we jump into the API endpoints, I think it's important to understand what an artifact in Massdriver actually is so that we can understand how we can use them to our advantage. In short, an artifact is a resource that is created by a deployment, much like a subnet is a resource within your Postgres bundle. So artifacts serve as the output of provisioning and the input of downstream bundles. What's unique about artifacts is that they are typed. Okay, so our artifacts adhere to a specific type called an artifact definition. When I built my Postgres bundle, for example, I claimed that my bundle was dependent on a network artifact definition. When I claim a dependency on an artifact definition, my bundle is able to make a contract with that network bundle that outputs that same type. That contract allows my bundles to share information in a downstream direction so that my Postgres server uses that network to deploy into. Something that's interesting about Massdriver's artifact system is that we actually share more information than just IAC outputs. We can actually share security groups, IAM policies, and even metadata such as region or the version of a bundle. We can also connect bundles that use different IAC languages like Terraform and Helm, and we can share information between those IAC languages using our artifact system. So now when I go to add an API endpoint to my backend application running in Massdriver, it's important to understand that we are, in essence, creating an artifact for my application, and then we are associating the artifact to a specific type, aka an artifact definition. Let's go ahead and look at what that artifact definition looks like. So I'll go ahead and post a link to the artifact definitions repo in Massdriver into the chat here so you guys can look along with me. Let me go ahead and share the artifact definitions repo. So this is our artifact definitions repo. And again, if anyone has any questions about what I'm doing, please don't hesitate to ask in the chat. So if we drill into the definitions directory, and then we're going to go into artifacts, what we're going to see here is a list of artifact definitions that all of our users are able to use. We have some cloud-specific artifact definitions and some cloud-agnostic artifact definitions. Now, this list doesn't cover every type of output a bundle could have, right? Like that would just be an insane amount of artifact definitions. This repo just serves as a really good starting point. In fact, we urge you to create your own artifact definitions using our Mass CLI tool. And you can do that as you need to, which will help you extend the platform to fit your requirements. But for my use case in my demo today, in enabling an API point for my backend application, I'm interested in the API artifact definition here at the top. So as we can see with this artifact definition, it's actually just JSON. So as a user, I know my backend application needs to output an endpoint that my front end application can consume to make API calls. So what I'm really interested in here is the host name. And we can follow the JSON path similar to how you would follow the path using JQ. We can follow the path down to the host name. So if I ignore the properties blocks just for a moment, it would look like this. We have data, then we have API, and then we have host name. There are other values here that I could use. In fact, the Etsy block here has additional properties enabled. So I could actually populate it with literally whatever data I wanted it to. But for my use case, I'm only interested in the host name. Okay, cool. So now let's go ahead and look at my backend application. So we can have an idea of how to structure that API artifact. So let me go ahead. I'm just going to stop share, and then we're going to present my backend app. Okay, so let me move this over here. Make sure that I am streaming the right thing. There we go, perfect. Okay, so for webinar purposes, I made a simple FizzBuzz application in Go. So if I look at my Docker file, we can see that it's just a simple Docker file as well. And then if we briefly look at my front end, this is a simple front end static JavaScript application. And then same thing with the Docker file, very simple Docker file. Very simple for just a webinar here all around. And I actually have both of these applications deployed in Massdriver. But let me go ahead and share Massdriver here actually. Apologies for a bunch of screen switching. Let's share this now and switch over to Massdriver. So as you can see, this is my architecture. I have my backend app, I have my front-end app. It's running on Azure AKS and connected to a virtual network. And this is the Massdriver platform, by the way, if you aren't familiar with it. So my backend application and my front-end application are up and running. They are not connected to each other. So what I'm trying to do here, the problem that I'm trying to solve is my front end app and back end app actually can't talk to each other right now. I need to set the dependency in my front end app to be able to make calls to my back end app. If I actually go to the URL for my front end app, for example, we'll just grab this URL and then we'll go ahead and open up a new tab. Button and switch here. So this is my front end app. It's just a static serving content. If I type 16, for example, we can see that I'm having a failure to be able to fetch that value from my backend application. So what I want to do is create an artifact for my backend. I'm going to go ahead and share VS Code again. So we'll switch back to that. We'll add to the stage. Okay. So now within VS Code, I need to go into my backend application and I'll go into my Massdriver directory. Let me go ahead and close all these. So I'm going to go into my Massdriver directory. This is where the actual application template lives for my application. And then if I go into the source directory and then we can go into artifacts, this came commented out with my application template, specifically the Kubernetes deployment template. It comes like this out of the box. Your application template, depending on the one that you select, may or may not come with this artifact file. And if it doesn't come with this file out of the box, that's okay. All of the functionality of artifacts and API endpoints are still supported. So we have kind of two options here for my artifact. I can either uncomment out the public artifact resource and then the public section in the locals, or the private or the internal. And they kind of serve two different things. You know, understanding my own backend and front end application, I know that my application needs to talk over public because it is a static JavaScript application, so it's not able to reach the Kubernetes cluster internally. I'm gonna have to make public calls, and that's okay. I know my architecture, and I know what I need to be able to support that. So what I want to do is I want to start uncommenting and bringing support for my public Massdriver artifact. And then I can just uncomment out this section here. And then I'll just go ahead and recomment the internal section. So what I'm doing with Terraform is I am generating a Massdriver artifact that's going to be publicly spec'd, and then I'm uncommenting the local sections that's going to support that. And we're going to see how this is structured here in a minute. So a quick description of what this resource here is actually doing, just so you guys understand. This resource is essentially just creating a JSON object, and it's populating it with the output values from my IAC. In this case, it's going to be Terraform. So as we can see, these are where my outputs are going to be living. Within the API block, we have the host name, and then we're populating that host name value with values that are coming in from the deployment and the output of the IAC. We also have other values that I can use as well, like the port and the protocol, but it's essentially just creating that JSON object and populating with values. And the structure of this is kind of similar to the artifact definition that we were looking at. So if we kind of look through the structure, even though it's broken up into locals, even if you're not familiar with Terraform, you'll kind of see a similarity here. So we have the data block, which is down here in the actual resource. And then in the locals, we have the API block, and then we have the hostname field. So it's the same structure that's coming through and that we're using. Let me just pick up where I left off here. Sorry about that. Okay, so I have the API block and then I have the host name. Now that I have those sections uncommented, I'm not actually quite done here. I'm creating the resource, but I actually need to map the resource to an artifact definition. And I'll do that in the application's massdriver.yaml file. So this is the Massdriver.yaml file for bundles within Massdriver. It does a lot of cool things like essentially allowing you to control the configuration page within that bundle in Massdriver. And you can do other things too, like setting environment variables, IAM policies, third-party secrets, things like that. And then we can do other things like setting dependencies and outputs. So if I scroll down a bit, I'm going to find the artifacts section. Here's the connection section for dependencies and inputs, and then here's the artifacts section for the outputs. So what I want to do is similar to what I did in the artifacts.tf file, is uncomment the sections that I want for the type of artifact that I want. So I know I need a public artifact, so I'm going to uncomment all the public sections. Now, this artifacts layer is the top layer, and then required public and the reference. The reference here is actually on line 207. This is actually to the Massdriver API artifact definition. When you create and publish your own private artifact definitions, it'll look a little bit differently. Maybe it'll look something like liqueur/foo, for example, right? Liqueur happens to be my organization name in Massdriver. So when you publish a private artifact definition, it's prefixed with your organization name. And then foo is just the name of the definition that I set. So if I had published an artifact definition like this is how I'd reference it in Massdriver. But I'll go ahead and switch back since I want to use the official Massdriver API artifact definition. I'll go ahead and set that there. So now we're set. I can actually publish my backend app's changes to Massdriver, and I'll do that in the terminal here on the side. And what we're going to do is type in mass bundle publish. I need to Massdriver, mass bundle publish. Perfect. So now I want to redeploy my application so I can get that new artifact resource. Let me go ahead and switch over to Massdriver again. Stop screen, present, and then we'll switch over to Massdriver. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh my page here. And then as we can see, we have a new update available for my backend application. So I'll go ahead and just configure and deploy. And we'll let that deploy in the background. So a new artifact is essentially going to be created here. And in fact, if we notice, if I close this configuration page, we can actually see the bubble is being popped up, but it's not populated with anything yet because the resource hasn't been created. The artifact definition's been associated, but the resource is still in the creation process. So once that provisioning is done, then we can go in and actually see the artifact definition that's created. And there it is. So if I hover over it now, we see that the artifact definition that's being mapped actually has a resource with it. If I see type Massdriver API. So now I can actually connect this into downstream resources, and they'll get values from my backend application. So if we look at my front-end app here, my front-end app has one connection point, and it's specific to the Kubernetes cluster. I don't have an API connection. And that's actually because I have to go and add it in to my front-end application as well, so that it has a different input. And we can do that within VS Code. So I'll go ahead and switch back here. And we'll switch over to VS Code. Okay, so we'll go ahead and close my backend stuff for now. We don't need backend anymore. We're just going to go in my front-end application. And inside my Massdriver directory, I have the massdriver.yaml. So this is very similar to the massdriver.yaml that I just had for my backend application. And this is for my front end. And again, if anybody has any questions so far, please go ahead and post it in the chat. I'll be happy to answer them. I have coworkers in the chat that'll be happy to answer them as well. So we'll go into the Massdriver.yaml and we'll want to do two things. The first thing that we want to do is add the connection for our backend, which declares a new dependency. So we're going to go down to the connections block here, and then we're going to add a new connection. So we're going to do a new line. We'll call this backend, and then we'll ref the Massdriver/API artifact definition, and then we'll make this connection required. So we'll call backend. So what this is essentially doing is this is creating that new bubble, that new connection point on my block, on my front-end application. And so this expects the connection to be made, and then I can use that connection to actually fetch information. But the fetching of that information is not done automatically. All I'm really doing here is creating a new dependency and allowing the connection to be made to my front-end application. To fetch any values, I need to do that at the top of my Massdriver.yaml in this app block. So this is the second thing that we need to do. With the first step, by creating the connection, we're basically implicitly stating that any connections made to the specific connection must match the Massdriver API artifact definition. Now I want to inject an environment variable so that I can fetch the backend API endpoint so that my front-end application can consume that endpoint. And then we're going to do that in the ems block up here under the app block. So what I want to do is create a new environment variable, and we're going to call this backend endpoint. So I'm setting a new key here, and the value and the key that I set is going to be injected into my application's container at runtime so that my application is able to use that key and that value. So what do I set the value to? I could use just a static string. I could use like @text, and then if I wanted to do foo.backend.com, for example, like this theoretically could work, right? Like I could publish this, I could deploy it, but it's not very scalable. Like if I wanted to replicate this application across multiple environments, this doesn't help with scalability because I'm setting a static value here. So this is archaic and definitely not smart use of our tool here. Instead, as I alluded to earlier, I can actually use a JQ expression to dynamically generate, or dynamically fetch rather, the API endpoint from the artifact resource that my backend application creates. So we're going to do that like this. For those who are not familiar with JQ, by the way, just a little educational thing. JQ is a command line JSON processor. Think of it as like the Unix sed tool, SED, for JSON data. So this is how we're going to structure it. The first element is going to be .connections. Now, why .connections? Well, we declared a new dependency in our connections block, if you remember. So down here, go down to the bottom of the file, we declared a new dependency, and that dependency is living inside of the connections block. So we're essentially sifting through that connections block there. Then I'm going to do .backend. So again, the same thing. We are going through the connections block, and now we're going through the backend connection. So we're specifying the connection that we want to fetch information from. So I could do something else other than .connections if I wanted to. Like I could do .params, and I can actually filter through my params block. So let's say that I wanted to inject a key value pair based on a value that I set in Massdriver, in the GUI, right? In the field where I can type it in using the GUI. Well, I can actually go through the params and set the dynamic fetch for that param. And so any value that I insert in a Massdriver and deploy, that value will be matched with this key. But for my use case, I want to fetch from my backend application. So I'm going to do .connections. And then we're going to do .backend to specify the name of the connection that I want to filter through. And then the same principle is applied from the JSON structure for the artifact definition. If you recall, when I wanted to find the host name and I ignored the properties blocks, the path went data, API, host name. That structure is going to be applied here too. So it's going to be .connections, .backend, .data, .api, .hostname. And this is all I need. This is all I need to fetch the data that's coming through, the hostname specifically, and then map that value to this backend endpoint key that my application can then use for everything my application needs to do. So now that I've gone ahead and made this change, we're going to do mass bundle publish again. So we'll cd into webinar front end. Front end, Massdriver, and mass bundle publish. Okay, so that just published the changes to our front end application as well. Let's go ahead and switch over to Massdriver so that we can refresh and deploy those changes. So we'll go ahead and stop share. Switch over to Massdriver. Okay, so we'll refresh our page here. And then as we can see, there's a new update available for our front end application and a new connection point. So I'm going to make this connection here, and then I'll go ahead and go to the config tab and redeploy my application. So this will just take a minute to deploy. Now that I've drawn that line, I can essentially fetch that information that I need for my front end application so that my front end application can make the requests that it needs to. It's able to talk to the backend server now. And we did that using the public artifact endpoint. So this will just take a minute. There we go. It has been deployed. So now let's go ahead and switch over to my front end application. I'll go ahead and give it a refresh. We'll type 16. And there we go. My application is up and running. I can type 72, and then we have a list of FizzBuzz responses. So now it's working perfect. All right, let's go ahead and switch back to the slide. And I'll pull up that go. Okay, so to recap what we just went through, we talked about the concept of artifacts. So what they are, a high-level overview of how they work with artifact definitions. We then dove a bit deeper into artifact definitions, mainly the API definition, and this is what we wanted to use for application. We figured out what value we needed and how to fetch that value using a JQ expression. Then we added the API endpoint artifact to my backend, and it added the new API dependency to my front end. And then lastly, we republished and we redeployed our applications and then tested to ensure that we got the results that we wanted. Okay, so this actually concludes our webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'll be sticking around to answer some questions. If you're interested in learning more about Massdriver, please check out massdriver.cloud, or you can schedule a demo with this link here as well. See you guys next time.